to sit next to
Hello and welcome to our panel discussion, Defaunation from Conservation Science to Conservation Action. My name is Marion Junkersdorf. I work on the policy team for WWF Germany, and I'm your host for this discussion. We heard some brilliant talks about the topic of defaunation. I hope that many of you had the opportunity to listen to what we heard this morning. I do believe, without being repetitive, it makes sense to run through some words. We heard about wild meat as an indispensable source of protein for local communities. We also heard about the devastating effects of unsustainable hunting. And definitely these two are going to be part of our discussion. We heard about the loss of larger species, the downsizing effects. We heard about wild meat, how it contributes to the wealth of communities as well. We have heard, on the other hand, about some things that I found a bit surprising, like how you have to deal with animals on a very individual level. You might have to, because they have gone through certain experiences and that shapes their behavior. So basically, we have covered a lot of ground leading up to our discussion today. What we are going to do with our discussion is to provide a platform for scientists, conservation practitioners, and the donor community to come together and take a critical look at how current conservation strategies can be strengthened to deal with this global challenge. The discussion will focus on ways to integrate findings from recent scientific studies into conservation actions that can effectively address the defaunation crisis. In the next 90 minutes, I will introduce our four panelists, and they will give us a little insight into their perspective on the topic. Then we will have about half an hour of a panel discussion, and any questions that come up in your mind while we are just going through our discussion, please hold on to them, because afterwards we will have about half an hour to answer your questions. So I just say let's get started, and I would like to welcome the panelists. Should you please join me? So, Professor John Farr.
Oh dear.
We heard a brilliant talk this morning about bushmeat or wild meat, what I've learned now. I will not give a long background on you. We heard it this morning. You're one of the leading scientists on the topic of wild meat. You work at the Manchester Metropolitan University as well as for CIFOR. You have extensive field experience in Central Africa and South America. And you've covered you've covered many aspects of the field of wild meat, such as bushmeat consumption, the sustainable use of bushmeat, the role of bushmeat or wild meat in terms of malnutrition of children, so we've brought in health aspects, also like zoonotic diseases like Ebola. Throughout your 25 years of experience in the field, what would you say? Has the situation improved, or is it actually getting worse?
It's yes,
Go ahead.
I can use it. I love these gelato mics. I think things have changed in various fronts, of course. 25 years ago, when we started publishing in wild meat and bushmeat, virtually no papers had been out. In fact, the whole trend starts around about 95, and the first papers that we published came out. And now there's about 1,000 or something papers accumulated throughout that period of time. So in terms of knowledge, I think we have much more information, much more data, much more experiences in different parts of the world. But I think we still need to put all that action, that science, that wonderful science, put that action, that knowledge that we have accumulated in the last 25 years in changing the situation on the ground. And what do I mean by changing? You know, we have various levels of intervention. I think we need to work with rural and indigenous communities so that they have the right to hunt sustainably. I mean sustainably resilient species rather than endangered or protected species by a particular country. And then we need to be able to come up with solutions of alternative protein, for example, for secondary towns that are still dependent on the wild meat that comes out of the forest. And that's a major, major issue. On the other hand, we need to go to the metropolis level, the large cities in Africa and Asia and Latin America, and try to change the mentality of the citizens there so that they don't need to consume wild meat, because it's not important for the food security, it's just a commodity, it's just a luxury. So I think, although we know more now, there are still huge gaps in terms of interventions at rural, secondary town level, and large city level. And the strategies for these are very different. You know, working with rural communities, indigenous communities, is very much protecting their right from outsiders coming into their territories and taking the meat, which is their own. Secondary towns is a matter of thinking of ways of producing good alternative protein, which is accessible to the pocket of the people living in the area, but at the same time moves them away from their dependency on wild meat. And in cities, it may be a question of social campaigning and a question of, you know, changing people's attitude towards consumption of wild meat. I don't think we have done these three things properly yet. And I do not believe that just because we have information, we know what to do. And I think one of the great controversies or divergences that we have in the topic is the fact that we tend to think that we know it all because we know a bit, and we don't consider issues that need immediate intervention and attention. So we have made some progress, but more needs to be done. Yeah.
Shall I take it? Is this on?
You can have my gelato.
Okay, no, hold on to it. So I take it there is a very, very complex situation, and we have not found the proper way of addressing it yet. But that's exactly what we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
So, my next guest is Andrew Jilko, moving on here, from the Leibniz-Institut for Zoo and Wildlife Research in Germany. You are a tropical ecologist with a focus on ecology and conservation of endangered mammal species. And you have a wide experience in the field in Laos and Vietnam. You spoke about it this morning. What are your insights? John has spoken a lot about Africa. So could you tell us what is your experience in the field in Asia? We'll just move, take it over.
Okay. My experience in the field in Southeast Asia is actually quite eye-opening. The forests that I worked in central Vietnam and in southeastern Laos are really archetypal empty forests. There are most large mammal and bird species are gone. And in some areas, the rats and the squirrels that are left are now being taken out and at an alarming rate. So it's really a perfect example of what happens when unsustainable, indiscriminate hunting wipes out fauna from an ecosystem. And this has made me really think about the larger paradigms in conservation. We've had a few speakers touch on this already this morning. But there's a very strong focus, there has been a strong focus over the past several decades, since the early 80s when the conservation movement really took off, focusing on habitat preservation, save the rainforest, and that is, of course, very important. Because without habitat, we have complete defaunation, so there's no argument about making that a focus of the conservation movement. But as some other speakers pointed out this morning, we need to pay much more attention, in my opinion, to what's actually happening in the forests. We cannot rely on measures of habitat quality, habitat integrity, to give an indication of the overall biodiversity in an ecosystem. Because it is possible in some areas for the forest to be structurally intact and yet have very, very few vertebrate species left. And that obviously has implications for many things. It has implications for carbon sequestration, for local livelihoods, for cultural erosion. So we need to start paying more attention to this very difficult to measure, difficult to assess phenomenon known as defaunation.
Thank you very much. The impressions you gave were very dramatic and yeah, really got to me. So we're going to be talking about that more. Let me move on to my former colleague, Frank Basch. John Mayer. I said it would be a more dynamic setup.
Musical chairs.
Frank Basch works with the Federal Ministry for Environment. You're a biologist by training, and you also have field experience in Botswana, and you have a huge background in species conservation and community-based natural resources management, as well as sustainable trade issues. You've been with the ministry now for 10 years, I think?
Even more, yes.
Even more than 10 years. And you are responsible for biodiversity projects within the framework of the International Climate Initiative. We have heard about the threats, mainly in Africa and South America, in Asia. We got some examples. Now, the ministry is certainly aware. What does the ministry do to tackle that issue?
Okay.
Oh, you have one.
I have
wow.
one. Well equipped. Thank you, Maria.
Great.
Yes. Yeah, how may I start to answer your question? Let me just say one thing in front regarding the research. So we are talking today about the research. So this is a very important starting point. The most important tool we have to assess a problem, to understand a problem, and to find solution to it. And in this cascade of understanding and taking into action, I would like to elaborate a little bit more on. And so you're right, I'm a biologist, so I'm coming from science. But being in the ministry for more than 10 years, I've been tamed a bit. So I see things from a little different view, so I'm more a policy person now. But by heart, of course, I understand the needs of species and the people living with. So I hope, at least. But what is the BMU doing? I mean, on the one hand, we are funding projects to conserve nature, to conserve biodiversity in partnering countries, mainly in developing countries, of course. There we have two programs, which is the ICI, the International Climate Initiative, where we work in the area of biodiversity projects of this funding line. And we also have a specific program to address poaching together with BMZ. It's a partnership agreement on illegal wildlife trade between Africa and Asia. This is what we more practically do. But of course, what our main task is to negotiate the conventions. And the most relevant convention is, of course, the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, as well as CITES on Trade of Endangered Species, and CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species. But yeah, the CBD is a key convention, especially of most important at the moment, because we will have a new strategic plan to be decided at the next CBD COP. coming up end of October next year in Kunming, China. So we are now preparing for this new strategic plan and discussing with all parties what should be the content and how could this be assessed and stimulate conservation of biodiversity globally. I think we will have a chance to discuss the role of this convention, chances and difficulties a bit more intensely. So I will stop at this. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank. And the fourth panelist, now may I ask you to move a little bit? Martin Bostrom from KfW, the Development Bank. You are not a biologist, you are an agricultural engineer and economist. You started your career, also, if I would place that organization, so it's a political organization, FAU, Food and Agriculture. You worked in Tunisia for 4 years with PZ, and now for almost 20 years you have been a project manager with KfW. You've been dealing with projects around sustainable resource management, and your focus areas are the Congo Basin and Madagascar and Africa in general. With these two.
Yes.
Okay. Now we've heard about the situation, we have heard about the BNU. There was actually a connection already with the initiative on illegal wildlife trade and the BNZ. So what does the KfW, how does it address the topic of defaunation? Does it address it, and how? Is it working?
It's working. Yes, thank you. KfW is German Development Bank, and everything we do, or almost everything we do concerning defaunation or biodiversity is financed by German Development Finance. The German Development Corporation can be BNU, but only a small fraction, but let us say 90% is financed by BMZ. So the Ministry for Development Cooperation, and therefore you see the focus is mainly, or if we're doing projects for biodiversity, it's also dealing with for the people. So in the end, the people are the objective. And well, as you know, biodiversity is, let us say, the basis for survival of the humankind, and therefore Germany is quite involved. It is probably one of the main players in terms of biodiversity financing, and our present portfolio is around 1.5 billion euro in terms, mainly 60% for protected areas. So if I listen to my predecessors, I can only agree entirely. The situation, I think, in Central Africa concerning defaunation beyond protected areas is almost like in Asia. Therefore, if you look at large parts of WRC, beyond the protected areas, you don't find any wildlife. But on the other hand, you have still quite some large areas, the protected areas, and also some of the forest concessions, where you have so logging concession, where you have still considerable biodiversity. So if you, for example, looking at gorillas are, let's say, more widespread in forest concessions than in a lot of protected areas.
Could you give us an idea of what the projects are, of the KfW projects that address this issue? How, what sort of
KfW is a financing institution, so we don't implement. So we need always an implementing institution. And our partner is a bilateral cooperation, so the partner is almost always the government. So we are concluding contracts with the government, and also the governments have the responsibility for biodiversity conservation. And well, if you're looking at the capacities of our partner countries, mainly in Africa, then they always need help. And so either it's done by consultants, or also to a large part by NGOs. So we're very often together with WWF or WCS for the implementation of the project.
Okay. we're going to definitely come back to the cooperation with the governments in the, you can leave it on. Now, I would like to start the next round of questions, and please feel free to comment on whatever the person says I'm asking. The first person I'm asking is John. If you have seen any improvement in the areas you've been studying, would you say this improvement was due to financial investment on a certain scale maybe? Or would you see a correlation between the two that is clear?
Okay. I'd like to think that there is a correlation. I don't know, at the moment I can't tell you whether there is a very strong correlation between having money and coming out with the needed outcomes. I think there are, I'm sure my colleague from KFW will tell us more about this, but there are different levels of achievements within projects, and sometimes that level of achievement has nothing to do with the amount of money you put into it, but very much by the motivation and the championing of the project by people involved in that. You know, I come from organizations where individuals are incredibly important in making a difference. So my general answer to your question, is there a correlation between sort of financing and outcomes? Of course there is, but maybe that correlation should be better, because my experience with big international multilateral projects sometimes has been that it is very easy to convince a bank of all the good work that we have done, and very little, if you want, very little assessment by them and by others of the work that I show you as being important. So in other words, I feel, and this is perhaps my cynical old person view of the world at the moment, is that there is very little, there should be more assessment of the effectiveness of the project on the ground. And just because you tell someone, I have done wonderful work, and everyone is happy, and look at the lovely community here, how they clap their hands every time you come together. I'm going to show you a video of that. I don't think that is enough. And I put it out there that there must be, in my opinion at least, there must be a better way of actually assessing outcomes. And not all multilateral organizations do it in the same way or as effectively. Frankly, I know the Germans do it very well. You know, my experience with them in working in Cameroon and all that, there is a rigor which is laudable. But I think it is incredibly important that we don't actually, that people don't get away by saying, I have achieved something just because I am telling you, so give me the money. There has got to be an accountancy, an accountability rather, which I feel is still very low. It's very easy to convince some people that you've done very good work, and in actual fact, it is still very much there without proving it. And I'm going to launch another point, and that is, as a scientist, I feel that often we tend to convince, or try to convince donors, that we do wonderful science that in, let's say, a 3-year project. We accumulate tons and tons of data, and that data doesn't get ever analyzed in the actual lifetime of the project. In fact, it gets put into drawers, and nowadays you don't use drawers, but you use computer files, and nothing is actually, you know, I think the donors should be asking questions and providing the finances so that there is science in real time during the project so that we can make decisions on the ground. I don't believe that science is a be-all and end-all, but I think if we are going to use evidence-based actions, we have got to allow and urge the donors to allow us to do that work during the lifetime of the project.
I have to come back to
Yes,
you right away.
Good.
So there was a praise in what John said. He said the Germans actually do it very well.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to say that. I mean,
Don't ruin it!
not really.
And then there was, and John talked about science shouldn't be science for science sake, but science should be made applicable much faster. And I know that
Yes.
this is something, you know, he's kind of blowing your trumpet there.
Yes, well, I totally agree. We always, in all our projects, we always have kind of indicators concerning wildlife density and flag species. And we very often we put an X in the beginning of the project and an X in the end of the project. We don't have any data. And or then there is some examination, some research done, and the next expert comes, oh no, what you did is fine, it's completely wrong, it doesn't apply for this situation. So this is certainly a big difficulty. But what you said, that it's not sufficient that you just tell it's good what you've done. I think normally in development cooperation you always have to have a sustainability in what you're doing. And but I'm quite frank towards BMZ that I think what we are doing in Central Africa and Madagascar is not sustainable. So we are financing, and with our finances, we are buying just a bit of time. So if we're going back, so if we finance a protected area for a certain time, and afterwards we cannot assume that Cameroon or DRC will finance this at the same level. So it's really we try to achieve a bit of more of sustainability with conservation trust funds, so for a sustainable financing of this, but we can still not claim that in the foreseeable time frame that the partner countries will take over. This is really a pity. On the other hand, I think I saw a picture, I think from Thomas, who showed the threat for elephants or wildlife with the presence of eco-guards and without presence of eco-guards. And I think a sheer presence is already something. So even also the presence of tourists is also something, a good thing for protected areas. So even though it's quite difficult to really measure your impact of what you're doing, if you don't do anything, so it always is better than if you do something, if you have a relevant presence in the field, that you have at least a much higher protection in the protected area than outside the protected area. And this is, I think, already something. Well, then you can talk about the efficiency of resource utilization, but anyway, there is a certain effect.
Andrew, from the scientific side and from your experience, what would you say? How can science and scientific findings really truly help to guide, for example, large-scale conservation planning?
That's a good question. I think, in my perspective, one, at a really high level, one would be, as I said, to start focusing more on what's actually happening under the canopy, what's happening in the forest, so that we don't simply look at remote sensing-based metrics for the health of an ecosystem, because if you're going to look at an ecosystem, you need to try to account for multiple aspects of biodiversity. So I think there is a case to be made for a shift away from simply habitat preservation and moving more into trying to track wildlife, assessing wildlife populations on the ground, which is a very difficult thing to do because it's time intensive, it's resource intensive, it's just a lot of work. And yet I think that it's important that we take that step so that wildlife populations are assessed with the same rigor as habitat quality, habitat preservation. So that's one. I also think these large-scale in situ conservation assessments of biodiversity have implications for directing where to send limited conservation resources, for example, for anti-poaching efforts. And then
another factor that kind of ties into something that has already been discussed is that I think it's important to try to track the effectiveness of a conservation project on the ground. And at the end of the day, at least if you're concerned about wildlife, that is whether or not those populations are declining or rebounding. So I think it's quite important that rigorous scientific conservation baselines are established in key sites so that we know if the conservation actions are having the desired outcome. And if they're not, then we need to ask why not? Can we do something differently? Is it simply a matter of shifting strategy, or do we need to put more effort into what we're doing? But we need to, I think that's where science really plays into contributing to on-ground conservation, is a way of tracking success.
So you would be advocating, for example, a more fluent model of project design. Would that be an idea?
Potentially. That's kind of opening up another can of worms, because usually people write a project to say we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and then you have to do X, Y, and Z. But if there could be more flexibility built into that process, I think it wouldn't necessarily hurt.
Frank, you mentioned climate change already as part of your work, and you work at the intersection, so to say, of biodiversity and climate change.
Yes.
You're not comfortable with that
No.
phrase.
Yeah, maybe I can just, I mean, the ICI, the International Climate Initiative, was established 11 years ago. And initially it was addressing climate change issues only, so mitigation, adaptation to climate change, also REDD+, reduction from natural resources, and about 8 years ago it was accomplished by the funding area for biodiversity conservation. But this should contribute, of course, to climate change issues, which usually is the case, of course. So, what was the question?
The question was to be asked. And my question is, we have heard about ideas, how science could inform projects.
Yeah.
Maybe possibly better. This is what we're trying to think about. So what would you say? Would you need more scientific data to decide upon projects within your International Climate Initiative? Would that help you?
Of course. Of course. I mean, as it was already discussed, science, data, research is fundamental for assessing also the project outcomes. But the question is about the sustainability. These are two issues, actually. If we can have a very, very nice, very effective project, closely assessed, and then it's over, and then it's falling apart. This happens, unfortunately. So, and the question of sustainability is giving us often headaches. I mean, we are working with countries sometimes not very stable or not very committed to biodiversity conservation, to be very honest. So, and if you would have asked me if we need more research for policy advice, I would have said no and yes. But no, because we have so much information for policy making, for taking action at the country and the global level, and too little is done so far. So, and nobody should say these days, we don't know, we need more research, then we can decide on actions. So, and this is, I will, you mentioned already climate change, and I see some developments over the past, let's say, 2-3 years that are very promising, I would say. Because in general, I do not believe that politicians will act only on scientific data. Even if they're brilliant, true, and emerging. But they will only act in favor of their population. So, and if there is no understanding, awareness,
Popularity.
and need, what?
And popularity.
And popularity, yeah. So what we need is creation of awareness in the societies. And in my experience over the past 2 years, we have come to a point that due to climate change issues, actually, that's my strong belief, this triggered some behavioral changes. So people can feel there is climate change. We can see the forest dying. We can feel the heat. And people start changing if they are affected in a positive or negative manner. And this forces the politicians at the policy level to take action. And that's where we need science. Maybe we need also some new approaches of science to better approach the common people, to make aware that they are effective. And we have so much, I mentioned climate change effects. And they also, I'm quite sure that they triggered a better understanding of the importance of biodiversity for the people. And for example, in early May this year, the IPBES Global Assessment on the Status of Nature or Biodiversity and their Ecosystem Services has been published, and it was really well received by the media. It was amazing. And we had the same, a kind of the same assessment about 15 years before. IPBES was not there yet, but it was under CBD. The message was not as dramatic as now, but more or less the same. We know this all since many decades, but the response was not like that. Not at all. So, and this we need to support. We need to support the global awareness on biodiversity, using also synergies with the climate change debate and tools. And not to be too complex now, but I see also chances. It was mentioned that the investment in Madagascar is, for example, not sustainable, and we have many cases like this. That if the value of natural forests, peatlands, ecosystems is not there, but due to the growing understanding of the role of carbon sinks, and maybe a better international trade in carbon emissions and so on, these ecosystems will become valuable, hopefully. And we see first discussions towards this, and the world community is looking for cheap solutions and nature-based solutions, such as rewetting of wetlands, keeping the rainforest alive, is often more efficient or more cheaper than technical solutions. So sorry, that was a bit broad input.
No, actually, I think it's a good comment to direct us to follow our title, From Science to Action. John, you nodded
I nodded
like
very much. Whatever my friend says, I say yes. I just want to make 2 points, actually. We tend to talk a lot about protected areas. We tend to, and rightly so. I think protected areas are incredibly important in terms of safeguarding perhaps the last faunal elements that are found in a particular landscape. But I think we mustn't forget that we also need to do quite a lot of work outside protected areas. And I don't know whether the German bank or other funders are actually aware of the fact that we might be able to make quite a bit of difference to the overall landscape if we also considered outside protected areas, and especially communities that are found within them. My second point is that I don't believe, my experience has been that I don't think we're going to change everything from top down. I think it's crucially important that we work with local communities, and local communities understand the value of nature and nature-based solutions, like we've said right now. We mustn't forget that, and we tend to be very I don't know, very top-down, very, we must have more protected areas, we must have, you know, sort of legislation, international, all that, of course, but we also need that bottom-up type of approaches in which we can actually encourage people to be the custodians of their own future, and often we don't do that enough. And coming back to your point about the translation of science, I believe we don't do that well enough. I think us scientists generally, I consider myself a scientist, we tend to, frankly, live in our ivory towers and think too much about the next publication, the next impact factor, and whatever, and we tend to say we haven't got time to talk to people about the science that we've done, or the vision that we have, or the ways that we think we can change the world on the ground. And I think that paradigm has got to shift within academia, and I think it is shifting. But we need to understand, and we need to be given the opportunity, the breadth, to be able to do things that are socially responsible, that are socially acceptable, and do change the face of the world. And we can't just live with, you know, somebody said the disease of impactitis. Everything has to do with impact factors. And yeah, of course we are enveloped in that awful monster, which is ResearchGate. I shouldn't say that. I don't mean that. But, you know, in the nicest possible way, we all like to be able to have our papers well cited and everything else. But I think perhaps we should try, or academia should come up with a different way of dealing with world issues and being given the opportunity for science to be completely applicable, or partially or mostly applicable to world matters.
Thank you. Bostrom, there was a lot in what John said, I think, that reflects on your work and the work of KW. What is the role of protected areas in your projects? Do you also work outside of protected areas? Are you aware of what John said? Also the bottom up design. What would you say about that?
Well, I can just talk about Central Africa, and entirely agree with him. Normally, in all our approaches with protected areas, we always the buffer zone population is always comprised. So you cannot make any protected area work without the consent of the local population. It doesn't work. You cannot really. Well, perhaps it works with a very small protected area with a fence and a lot of violence, but this is not an approach we are supporting. And if I just give an example of the Southwest program in Cameroon, where since 2006 3 protected areas are supported, and where I would say half of the funds are going for local development, so also water, a bit of health, agriculture, and it's a very successful project. Well, now you have the Anglophone crisis, and this, of course, is a huge risk for the impact of the project. So it was very successful, apart from one aspect, which is the density of the flag species, because everything worked all right, but the poaching pressure didn't decrease. So only carrot doesn't work, and so in the next phase we had planned also to increase it with the stick. Right? So to also, well, you know, governance is also a problem. Right? So even if you take some poacher, bring him to court, and 2 days later, or 1 day later, he is once again free, and perhaps he takes revenge on the eco-guard. So it's very difficult also to be really successful. And so therefore I say we entirely agree that you can do it only with the local population, but it's also quite difficult, even though you know it. Yeah. And it's also very often a lack of capacities. And we have also, then I have to admit, our partners. So if your partner is mainly there's a biodiversity-oriented institution, then of course their priority is more the biodiversity, not local development. And so it's we have a lot of good intentions, but sometimes it's not enough.
I see. Would you like to comment?
You want to comment? I'll comment. I'm getting my money, so. But I totally agree. I know a little bit about your Southwest Cameroon project, and like many other projects in West Africa, Central Africa, just because we are working with communities doesn't mean that you don't apply the stick. You know, you do the carrot and then the stick. Often, sometimes, I think sometimes we tend to be very, I don't know, sort of thinking that you can't actually talk forcefully to communities, that you shouldn't do that because you're there to, and you should talk respectfully to communities, but often you need to talk with them in a forceful way so that you can get things happening for their sake and with them. And it's very important that we use the right language when we talk about working with communities, because often we tend to apply a very, frankly, very condescending way of talking about this. But just because we work with communities doesn't mean we can be forceful, respectful with them, so that we come up with the outcomes that are going to be beneficial ultimately for them more than for us. So I agree totally with you that you know, the first phase of the Southwest Cameroon, wasn't it, project, you know, needed a bit more stick, and now you're applying the stick. But maybe we should have thought of applying the stick along with the carrot right at the very beginning. But you know, that's something that we know as we move along. Projects are adaptive management exercises. We tend to understand things once we've done it, and then we move on to the next phase. I think it's very important that we do that properly and thoughtfully. Otherwise, we're not going to achieve what we need to achieve.
So we're talking about collaboration and who needs to talk to whom. On a different level, what sort of alliances do we need to have more robust conservation action and impact? Frank, what would you say about that? If you have
I can't decide it.
We need Spider-Man, Ant-Man.
That was my answer.
Oh, I knew it was.
Not to forget about Superman.
Of course. No, he's in a different universe.
He's busy dealing with climate change.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. This is a good question. I mean, we need. I mean, like in CBD, we like to talk about mainstreaming, and this is, of course, a very important approach, because conservation, nature conservation, should not be an issue only for nature lovers and biologists. It's an issue for economists, for development aid agency, for all people living in a society. But the problem is, as I already mentioned, it's the awareness about this relationship is not very well developed in many countries in this world. And so it is not really translated into policy action and conservation action, usually. And maybe you allow me to reflect a little bit on the process lying in front of us next year on the strategic framework development for CBD, or we call it the the global framework for biodiversity for the time after 2020. Not very consumer friendly, I agree, but so, and this is the fourth strategic plan of CBD to be agreed on. And I have to admit that the first three failed or are failing largely. I mean, the next, this one, the current strategic plan until 2020 will end somewhere next year. I'm not very well aware when it may be, maybe end of the year. But probably only 2 of the about 20 goals of this strategic framework will be achieved. One is on protected areas, and the other one is the IG target on the agreement on the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. So, well done, we have done it. So, but all other goals will be failures. So, and the question now is, how will this, the next strategic plan, this post-2020 framework look like? And the discussions are ongoing since last CBD COP, and it's a very difficult process, of course, and it is very unclear at the moment if we will have again a set of targets as before, or if we have maybe only 1, 2, or 3 goals of the convention. They called apex goals, so which represent or which are a bit broader. But the general problem of the CBD negotiations is that CBD has 3 main targets, which is sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity. The second one is access and benefit sharing of biological resources. And the third one is the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, which is for us now not very important. But the problem in the CBD negotiation is that some developing countries have completely different understanding of the function of CBD. For us, it's a convention for protecting biodiversity. But for many countries in the south, it is a convention for generating income from biological sources. And many countries are very much disappointed about the Nagoya Protocol, which was the agreement to facilitate ADS. But the flow of money from the north to the south never really happened. It's a very complex issue. So there is a lot of disappointment about the CBD. So, and that means also that, one example during the last COP, Brazil announced in the plenary they will not take money in hand to protect their biodiversity. That should be done by the countries from the north, not until we agree on strategies for better access and benefit sharing. So there are some discussions like synthetic biology, digital sequence information, but actually we better not go into details.
Yeah.
So, and this is a very, very difficult arena now to decide on a new framework. So, and it will be very much it will be interesting to see what is the outcome. And but still, we need the pressure and the awareness all globally. It should not be only in the hand of politicians. It should be in mainstreaming in the societies.
As I was listening to the presentations this morning, I was thinking, is defaunation, which is, for all I can see, not a very broadly used term so far, is it going to have the same unfortunate career as climate change? So is defaunation already, when it comes to the strategic plan, is it considered one of the main challenges? I mean, it should also raise awareness in other countries, for example? Did I say something wrong?
No. I just try. I'm struggling for a correct answer.
I can say something about that if you want that.
You want to reflect on the sustainable management guide?
Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You tell
Okay.
me.
No.
This is a good double act. You were there.
Yeah. Okay. No. Okay. Giving one example, we have agreed on a voluntary guidelines for sustainable wildlife management. It's addressing wild meat sector of the tropics and subtropics at the last CBD COP. And this was a long process, about 6 years, I think. And we negotiated all the scientific papers at the Substars, and John gave a huge impact, input in this process, which is well appreciated, really. So, and this voluntary guidelines, which are very good, they're very comprehensive, addressing all these drivers of trade, of overharvesting, and so on. They are still voluntary. And the main countries who should implement these voluntary guidelines did as much as they can to kill their countries' names from the documents and to neglect their responsibilities. Thank you. So this is a frustrating process, actually. And these voluntary guidelines were accepted with a cover note. And I think it was, we wanted to have a welcome with appreciation or something like that, and finally it was agreed on taking note of. So, so this is a good example how you could water down a very important issue down to something you don't know what will happen later on with it. So, and what we try to do, of course, when we in IKI is that we try to implement as much of these guidelines, also others guidelines as well, in the project implementation, the relevant areas. So, but we need but we don't see, I can't really feel the commitment of the affected countries and to solve this problem.
Absolutely. Okay, maybe
We have about 5 more minutes
oh,
before we
Andrew,
open the floor.
You better say something.
Would you like to comment?
Yes, but can you reread your question earlier about alliances in conservation?
What kind of alliances can we forge to achieve more robust conservation action impact?
Yeah, 2 quick thoughts on that. One, I think there could be much more cooperation between implementing agencies on the ground, whether these are government partners or NGOs or both, and academic institutions, because the academics in their ivory towers are have their finger on the pulse when it comes to the latest, most effective types of analyses or surveys that we need to obtain rigorous conservation baselines, which is not always an easy thing to do. So there are excellent examples of these types of collaborations, but I think there's much more room in this area, especially considering the fact that PhD students are such cheap labor. It's a great way to for implementing agencies to obtain the robust information they need for their projects. So that's one quick thought. The second thought that I would say is that I think there's more room for conservation, for traditional conservation scientists to work with people outside their narrow field. So I can't speak for other people in the room, but I got into conservation because I wanted to study animals, but I didn't want to just study animals for the sake of studying animals. So, you know, what do? Oh, I should go into conservation. Then as a scientist, I have some impact. And when you get out onto the ground, it doesn't necessarily work that way. It's not that black and white, because as other people have mentioned earlier in the day, conservation is about people. And if you want to achieve desired outcomes, you need to change people's behaviors or attitudes or perspectives. Science can guide the actions that we need to take in the most effective way to get to a certain endpoint, but ultimately it's about changing behavior. And so in that context, I think there is a lot of room for traditional conservation scientists with an ecological background who came from that ecological background to work with social scientists or people who were involved in criminology research. There are disciplines that study how to change people's behavior, and I think that traditional conservation scientists could do a much better job of reaching out to these other people in these other disciplines, so that we have the desired outcome.
One last question inside the panel. Frank Barasch portrayed the process of the CBD, and you mentioned earlier that there are issues working with governments where the projects are actually situated. Do you feel the political process helps you with this issue of collaboration with governments?
Well, I can just talk about Central Africa, where I don't see any real political support for conservation efforts. So perhaps they tell it at CBD, but in fact nothing is done. Governance is a disaster at all levels, and so without the cooperation with NGOs, other civil society organizations, also and having also sometimes consultants, one could not really implement projects. Situation is a bit different in Madagascar, where you have also a certain ownership at civil society in Madagascar, and a bit more political commitment. On the other hand, the government is so poor that they don't finance anything, but they let the external finances do their work. So this is also a good thing. But so I have also quite a bleak perspective for the next decade, and therefore, unless it's done by the North, it won't be done. On the other hand, if you're looking at Cameroon, we have still 45% of forests. You cannot really ask them, you have to maintain everything. So if you're looking at our countries, how much we destroyed, and so we can just ask them to make a good management of the natural resources, to leave the best values of biodiversity intact, and then concentrate development on those areas which are already degraded. This would be the approach, but of course it's also not followed because it's not in their particular interests. But well, once again, I can only support the offer to work better together, because in the projects, so well, PhD students are cheap labor, yes, and they are also increasing the presence in the field, and they also can increase the consciousness of the local population. They can also increase our understanding of the perception of the local population, and in the end also improve our approaches. And there's certainly not enough is done, and I don't know why.
Okay, I would now like to open the floor and move back into the middle. We have a question there.
Thanks for the wonderful input. I mean, I don't want to sound very accusative, and I'm not being accusative at all. But the point is that whenever we talk about defaunation, we talk about tropical developing countries losing a lot of wildlife. And even when I run into, I'm not just talking about this point, but even when I run into WWF volunteers in the streets, they tell me about how tigers are becoming extinct, how pandas are becoming extinct. But we rarely talk about historical defaunation that has occurred in Europe, in the US, in the entire developed world. And I mean, do we think of this as a situation that is developed beyond repair, or why is it that we do not talk about this issue?
Thank you for your question. One more thing I would like to add: if you raise a question, maybe you want to say your name, and if there's any organization that you work for, you would also like to mention that.
Okay, I'm Robert, and I'm a PhD student at the ICW.
So who would like to comment on this question?
I'm crazy enough. Because it's very difficult to answer, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it is always a problem to tell this house, you should do this and that, or ask them for conservation of species, while we have already done the worst job ever, and being left with little biodiversity, at least when it comes to large mammals and so on, of course. It is very difficult to turn back the time. I mean, we now, like in Germany, we have a density of 220 or 230 people per square kilometers. And we can't really revitalize wilderness to a large extent. We are trying hard to achieve our 5% goal wilderness in Germany that we have set about, I don't know when, 10, 15 years ago, and now we are still at 3%. So, and so I don't have a real answer to this question, but we have to take into account the situation we have today. And this is also, should also guide us for like the development of the post-2020 framework. One example, we have discussions on a 30% goal of protected areas in the marine areas and terrestrial areas. And when we implement it country by country, this would mean, if we would agree, let's say so, and if we would implement country by country, we would have increased our protected areas network, which is very difficult. But looking at a country like Gabon or so, or Tanzania, they have so much nature, wilderness left, then they would have the opportunity, then they could just cut down the trees, the forest, and it's easy to maintain 40%. So the answer to this question should be, we need a global mechanism. We can't force developing countries to sustain wilderness areas, large populations of elephants and whatsoever, but asking them to do it only from their own financial resources, while we won't be able to bring back nature to Europe. So I don't know how this could be facilitated. I don't have an answer, but I don't see a reasonable approach in setting a percentage of land or so on to be regenerated by country. You get my point.
We have another question here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Thorsten Krause, Lund University. I have a critical comment and a question. I think we should not shy away from actually analyzing the problem we're facing by its complexity, because it is complex. And I have a critical comment because I do realize that we often are looking for low-hanging fruits and we're talking around the bush. When it comes to biodiversity conservation, Europe, Germany, is one of the biggest importer of biodiversity threats in the tropics. So actually the problem of biodiversity loss is here, for large part, in Europe, in China as well, Japan, North America. So it's laudable that European countries like Germany, Norway are financing some conservation projects in national parks, but really we're never gonna win the war with this. We have to address the real drivers, which is consumption in Europe. And you talked about interest in these countries. I think there is an interest in Europe that these things continue to run the way they are, because we're the ones who benefit from this global inequality that drives biodiversity loss and habitat loss. So that's a critical comment which I think is really important, because otherwise we can be leaving aside these complexities, these real challenges, by just focusing on one species that might be saved in one place, but actually, let's face the truth, it's not going to happen. My question is related to the defaunation topic. And you mentioned we have to look for alternatives to protein. Yes, but I also am sometimes worrying, or I'm not really sure, it's more like the thought I have. If we're looking for these alternatives, are we not actually just shifting, it's called leakage, we're not actually just shifting impacts on biodiversity somewhere else? For example, I work in Colombia. So people always say we should not hunt the animals, defaunation is really bad, they should eat chicken or beef. What does it mean? It means we should cut down the rainforest somewhere else to put some additional cows that then can be eaten by people, instead of leaving the rainforest and actually manage wildlife in a way that is sustainable and protects the environment. In the Brazilian case, now we see Amazonia is on fire. That's popular news. I mean, there's fires for soy production in order to feed the porks that we eat in the lentil soup that we had for lunch. So I'm like, well, so we have to address these global drivers, these like networks, because otherwise it's not gonna win the war of conservation, right? So yeah, thank you.
So who would be a choice to answer?
Politician. Maybe I can add a little bit to your question. But, well, obviously, we're not certainly in the wild meat sector. You know, the people sort of like us that are working on issues of wild meat. We're not saying that we should cut down forests in order to have cattle to feed people. We are saying that domestic protein alternatives are plausible in certain situations. I wouldn't do it in Leticia, in the areas where you work and I've been, because it's irrelevant there. It's not, but it is plausible to be able to do it in places like Kisangani in DRC, where there is a tremendous protein hunger, and that protein is coming out of the forest. So coming up with, I don't know how, but coming up with ways of breeding sort of chickens. There are one or two sort of examples of that happening in Nigeria and Zambia, for example, promoted by the Bill Gates and Melinda Gates Foundation, in which you can actually responsibly breed enough chickens to feed villagers and all that. It could be possible to do it. But you're absolutely right. We can't just come up with examples, solutions which are not really thought of. Originally, we used to talk about wildlife farming. The panacea to the problems of wild meat is that we grow, we breed cane rats and we breed this and that. And that's nonsense. It doesn't work. So solutions have got to be accompanied by well thought ways of dealing with issues. It can't be just, let them eat cake sort of thing. Right? And, we've got to do it in a better way. And coming back to Andrew's point about science, I'm not actually saying that the science is not going to be crucial and important and the scientists know about methods, etc. My basic problem with that is that those methods are not transferable to the ground, and people on the ground, especially those working in conservation, usually don't know about those methods or can apply the methods. So all of this translation of science and methodology and thinking out the problems without coming up with blanket solutions is fundamental. And you're absolutely right. We've had to look at the world in a broader context. It's not just a question, I would say we're not pinpricking, putting pinpricks in the hide of the animal. We need to, sorry for using a hunting metaphor, but we need to blast the animal completely out of the earth. And I mean the animal, the bad animal, which is doing things wrong.
We have one more answer here.
Well, of course, it's correct if you say that we don't solve the real problem. But it's the same is true if you're looking at development cooperation as such. So if you had much better terms of trade, it would be much better, of course. But I think you have to look specifically, and then if I look at the wildlife trade, bushmeat trade in Central Africa, I don't think that Europe is really to blame. This is we are not responsible for this. Who in Europe eats wild bushmeat? And this is really a domestic demand, and there we can do something which doesn't solve the entire problem, but which can mitigate a bit the situation. And this is what we are doing. We are buying time. Nobody claims to solve the problems of the world, unfortunately.
Well, Europe doesn't consume bushmeat, but Europe is a major conduit for the wildlife trade industry globally. And I
just ivory.
We have pangolin and rhino and other things. Yeah, so that is an issue that I think the
Okay, we have
North
four.
could be much better at mitigating.
Sorry, Andrew. We have 4 more questions, so I would like to ask that we do them rather quickly. Your question first.
Jacob from the Sofa. So I have a question to the experts on stage of the you said that for the implementation of your project, you work with bilateral agreement with governments and also poor governance. Then you work also with NGOs to implement the project. So given the importance of research, so I want to know if you also have some plans to include among those implementing agencies research organizations that are working on the ground, because we know that research is important. So not only conservation organizations like WCS or other organizations, but also research to have this good collaboration, this good network of partners that will have better impact on the ground.
Thank you.
Well, this is of course always possible with C4, for example. Also C4 is also financed by corporation donors. And but there's a research in terms of university or PhD students or whatever. This is done on a case-by-case basis. So because they say we would not, so the projects are not specific enough to say we want this and that topic being researched by universities. It should be much more a kind of that research institutions or researchers have a certain interest and look where we can have a development project that which is related to this topic, and this is more punctual cooperation.
Okay, thank you. There was a question up there.
Hi. So you spoke a lot today about how people are a major cause for change. Globally, we'll kind of shift focus slides there. Work in the zoo. 7 million people visit zoos annually. How can science be actually broken down better for zoos? Because you mentioned how academics are in the ivory tower and actually work from bottom up. Surely we need to utilise that better. And particularly following on the point of the gentleman down the front about Europe. If we actually utilise what we do in Europe better and actually educate the public, if you look what's happening now with climate change, we've actually spoken about climate change for decades, and now politicians are starting to listen because we are protesting, because children are getting up and leaving schools to make adults aware. So to the panel, I'm asking how can we actually utilise what we do better, and how actually zoos, which are on our doorstep, people can see biodiversity, how can we utilise that as well?
Given my experience in zoos, I can answer that a little bit. Let me start by saying that zoos can do much more than what they're doing at the moment. You know that. And there's 7 million people that go to zoos, or even more actually, globally, to the big zoos, can indeed be educated about conservation and about the state of the world and how they can actually contribute. So I do believe zoos have a tremendous potential in terms of educating the public. I also do believe that zoos, and you can read that in my book, Zoo Conservation Biology, I do believe that zoos can do something much more immediate and much more directly linked to species conservation work. And I know we can get into a debate whether it should be single species conservation, or it should be landscape or community conservation or whatever, but I do feel that there is a tremendous potential in the zoo world that can be unleashed to be able to do direct species conservation work on the ground. And in the organisation I worked for many years, Durham Wildlife Conservation Trust, on its own has been able to achieve literally the saving of about 16 different species throughout the world, including 3 species of birds in Mauritius, pygmy hogs in India, etc. So it can be done in both. I think, again, it's a question of unleashing the potential of many organizations so that we do things better, far more efficiently, and with the support of the public. I think your point is that we can't do things on our own thinking that we have the only solution to the problems. I think the public and people in general have got to be there with us.
There's a question from a lady in red.
John, you had before you claimed that scientists should or science should be more used in order to prove that the implementation of the project it works, and it should be more used scientific papers in order to show, yes, the money was well invested. But especially with these problems, we are talking about defaunation and loss of forest or to reverse biodiversity. These are long-term projects.
Yes.
So you cannot prove this in a short period of time, and that's also one main issue I have with the funding. Usually the funding is very short, so in this short period of time you cannot really prove that something has happened. I'm thinking about, reforestation of oil palm plantation, looking at how biodiversity is going back, be reversed. You cannot do this in a short 3 years project or even 6 years project. It's a long-term project. So how do you want to use science in order to really prove that this project worked and has been really well implemented?
Yeah, I wasn't actually saying so, but what I was saying is that we must be far more consequent in making sure, and certainly with the funders, making sure that the work that we do on the ground are achieving or are in the way to achieve the outcomes of the project. And I've become a great believer of theory of change. Because I think it accepts the fact that projects are in motion, are moving towards a target. It's not a question of actually just coming up with indicators and saying how many people have you trained, how many people have you done this to, how many animals have you saved. What I'm saying is that we must be far more consequent in the science that we do so that we are achieving the outcomes that we have set ourselves out to do. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not a question of 3 years. We know our projects, especially ecological projects or conservation projects, or even sociological projects, take forever, take a long time. What we must do as scientists is say, we can't be repeating the thing that we used to, we have been saying for years, we need more data, we need more time, we need more money. We can't keep saying that, and that is my criticism, that we've got to be aware of what our targets are and try to do as best as possible to achieve those targets. Now, the other thing that I'm concerned about with the funders is that the funders rarely go, in my opinion at least, is that they rarely go for continuation projects. That you often sort of go for a project and you have to invent another way of selling the same project to the funders so that you can go on for another 3 years. And then for God's sake, give us a break, give us more money so that we can continue having the wonderful way of life that we have. Not true.
Does anyone want to add up to this very briefly, because we're running out of time, or shall we move on to the next question? Okay, so next question comes from there.
Barry here from IZW. I like the thoughts from John and Andrew regarding how much science we know and how much data we have, but the foundation is continuing, or even just getting worse. With all decades of data and science have been doing, clearly doing something not right. I've found from my experience that trying to poachers themselves, it's not as complicated as science it is. Sometimes just the simple things like chickens or piglets, and they will stop going to the forest for the diapers and the bush pigs they hunt. And sometimes my experience, I've just thought that we overthink the problem, and I'm not saying it's as easy as it is from my experience. Could be different in other parts of the world. But as scientists, I think we've done more science and just have to approach the problem head on. It's conservation, it's humans killing or hunting the bush pigs or the diapers. Let's work the humans to solve the problem. That's my point of view.
So that's more of a comment than a question. So I would like to end this panel discussion on a positive note. And I would like to ask all the panelists the same question, actually. And I would like to start with you. You already said you have a bleak outlook for the next 10 years. So that's not exactly what I was thinking about. So my question to you is, if for the next 5 years, everything would go totally smoothly, the best possible way, where could we be in 5 years? And I would like you to answer this in 2 sentences because we're really running out of time. You have to be very spontaneous with this question.
Well, I think we're trying to continue to make good projects with the population in favor of biodiversity. And we can only hope for, say, punctual successes. So islands where it works. But I would not claim to solve the bushmeat crisis or the problem of the Congo Basin, but perhaps on the ground for a certain protected area.
Thank you. Who would go next? You. Go ahead.
Yeah. Fortunately, I had a bit more time to digest your question. So, no, in 5 years to come, I hope very much, and I'm not very strongly believing in, but I hope that 2 sentences, but they are very long sentences.
I see. Okay.
There's no comma in it. No.
Okay.
No, sorry. And no. Biodiversity, the biodiversity crisis, and the global warming is an issue of the world community. We are still acting only at the national level and just taking into account our national interests. But in 5 years from now, we may have come to a next stage that we act as a world. Yeah.
Okay, I think I'm going to be positive about the outcome in the next 5 years. I think, and there are initiatives that tell you, and I'm also just using a very long sentence. There are initiatives already. If you, the European Union, for example, is funding a very big project throughout the world, 13 sites. 13 countries, in fact, all over the world, Africa, South America, ACP countries, Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific. And this is, I think, a good example of how funders and big multilaterals can actually try to do something on the ground about the bushmeat issue. I mean, I don't like calling it bushmeat crisis, the bushmeat issue. And I think we should take heed of what the European Union Sustainable Wildlife Management Project is doing. And it has a component of science and research, but it has a component of actually doing things on the ground. And I think those sort of initiatives are fundamental if we want to make a sea change in the whole issue. It's not going to be easy. But 5 years of funding by the European Union to do this work, European Commission, sorry, is a good start, and it should be followed by many others like that.
Andrew.
Yeah, I would agree with much of what John said. I think ideally, in 5 years' time, the word defaunation would almost be a household word. It would be understood by almost anybody in almost any major northern or southern city, anywhere you are. I think that defaunation needs to be treated with the same level of severity as climate change is starting now to be treated in the global north. And that with that growing recognition among the general public, I would hope that larger organizations, whether they're government or non-governmental, would also start focusing more on this defaunation crisis. And that real change would follow on the ground as a result of this greater public enlightenment.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I would like to thank all panelists for coming and for sharing, and I would like to thank you. And
I think we should thank Marion for a very good